Once again, as we commence this new study, I invite you to open your Bibles. Today we're looking at Joshua chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. Now this chapter seems to commence a new section of the book, which is united by the use of similar subheadings. Chapters 5:1, 9:1 and 2, 10:1 and 2, and 11:1 to 3. If this is true, we can conclude that chapters 5 to 12 are a major section of the book, with chapters 5 to 8 a subsection. Nevertheless, this section is closely linked to the preceding section by what I will call the church meeting motif. This, I think, shows the consummate artistry of the author of the book. The interesting thing about the first verse and its reference to the fact that the Amorites' heart sank and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites, is that Joshua at this point could not have fully known this. Indeed, as we see in verses 13 to 15, he seems quite uncertain as to the way ahead. So we've been let into something that the Israelites don't know yet. They must have felt incredibly vulnerable. We, however, know a greater power was at work. This makes what happens next remarkable. In response to the Lord's command in verses 1 and 7a and 8, they undertake a painful medical operation on all the male population, such as to make them incapable of military service for at least a few days. This might therefore be jeopardizing everything. And why is there a reference to flint knives? After all, Joshua was living in the Bronze Age. The answer to these puzzles lies in the past. An ancient custom was being revived. The experience of Abraham, the founder of the nation, and we might compare chapter 17 and verse 11 of Genesis, is being repeated in his descendants. In this way, the original meaning and significance of circumcision was highlighted. It referred to those who were graciously chosen by God as his people. To unravel this further, we need to be introduced to two Hebrew words, am and goy. Both these words mean people, but they tend to be used in two slightly different ways. The latter word is usually adopted to refer to pagan nations. The former word tends to refer to Israel as the people of God. In this chapter, Israel entered the wilderness as an am, as we see from verse 4, but died a goy, as shown in verse 6. This generation too remains a goy, as verse 8 tells us, until after their circumcision. Verses 4 and 5 are various understood. The allusion is to Numbers 14, verses 28 to 32, but it's not clear whether the neglect to administer the rite of circumcision was the result of disobedience or at the direction of God. In the light of the previous paragraph, the latter seems more likely. Circumcision had been withdrawn from a people who were now a goy. Verse 6 seems to favour this interpretation. The latter part of verse 6 is slightly obscured by the NIV translation of two identical phrases, by the Lord had sworn and he had solemnly promised. The former is the better rendering. Thus God is as faithful to his oath to provide an inheritance to Israel as he is faithful to his oath to deny access to those who had not obeyed the Lord. In a nutshell, this is the fundamental theological perspective of this book. But now, and this is the point of this section, a new generation are given the gracious opportunity to enter into the covenant with the Lord. By their obedience, the reproach under which they had lain since the apostasy of the previous generation is removed. In this context, the Passover can now be celebrated, since circumcision, as Exodus 12:48 tells us, was a precondition. Indeed, the ultimate object of the Passover, to free a people from bondage and enable them to enjoy the full blessings of the land of promise, begins to be fulfilled here. With what joy the people must have enjoyed the produce of Canaan and tucked into the unleavened bread and roasted grain. What a whoop of delight must have gone up when they realized there was no longer any manna, nor indeed any need for it. Significantly, all this is enjoyed without a military campaign. What was important was not so much military strategy, but the people were in a right relationship with the Lord. Already in a land where the inhabitants are fighting shy, Israel is enjoying the riches of the land. This is not, of course, the whole story, but it is the story at this point, and it's a point that must not be missed. Finally, we ought to note a point made by Dale Ralph Davis. He says, we must beware of thinking that God is only in the earthquake, wind and fire, of thinking that manna, not grain, is God's food. Most of God's gifts to his people are not dazzling or gaudy, but wrapped in simple brown paper, quiet provisions of safety on the highway, health of children, picking up a paycheck, supper with the family, all in an ordinary day's work for our God.